Christians of a fairly fundamentalist fire and brimstone variety. In other words, they believed in heavenly rewards and, oh yeah, it's brimstone, so it's not literal fire, it's so cold that it's hot. They believed in torturous damnation for the evil, and they believed in heavenly rewards for God's elect. Now his remark was, my parents are good people, but they lack the capacity to be moral people. My parents are good people, but they lack the capacity to be moral people. Do you get the distinction? It has to do with this. It has to do with their motives. If your motive is purely selfish, not only are you not doing it for moral purposes, according to Kant, because selfish purposes and moral purposes are at odds with one another. But ultimately, if you're really just carrying out your biological desires for pleasure, the question is, are you even acting freely anyway? I know many of you, I'm trying to make this case as solidly as I can. Not that I necessarily agree with it. But I'm trying to make this case as solidly as I can so you know what you're up against. Many of us would like to believe that we are free to choose to believe what we believe. But even our tendencies to believe certain things may be based upon biological factors that are unbeknownst to us. In other words, and by the way, even people's political profiles, you've heard of this, right? There have been studies in political psychology that have suggested that there might be hardwiring that leads certain people to lean liberal and hardwiring that leads certain people to be conservative. You've heard this before, right? You know, brain studies. And we also find out, psychologically speaking, that electrical activity happens split seconds before our conscious mind is aware of the quote-unquote decisions that we make. So even our quote-unquote decisions that we think were rationally and consciously made may just have already been made by what? Ping, ping, ping. Neurons firing, chemical reactions happening in the brain. Now these are not things that make some people overly happy. Because it seems to be this. It seems to be too reductive of an account of what a human being is. It seems to reduce us again to what I was calling just biological machines. Now, Immanuel Kant understands this, that if morality has any meaning, or if morality is going to be a significant concept, let me write this on the board here, that at least two things have to at least sometimes be possible. And I think before I say those two things, I want to put a word on the board. One of the revolutionary things that Kant engaged in is what is sometimes critical philosophy. Now, many of his works, the first word is critique. Critique of pure reason. Critique of judgment. Those are two names of some of Kant's major works. Now, the reason that we call them critiques is because he employs a critical method. And I'll run down what he means by that. By critical method, he does not make any presuppositions. In other words, that sounds a little bit like Hume. Yeah, that might remind you a little bit of Descartes, presupposing that I don't know anything and then I see where applying rationality takes me. Instead of presupposing, when he uses his critical method, he will examine under what conditions instead of assuming, that's whatever he's doing a critique of. And for example, we'll be talking about this. He is not going to assume that morality is possible. What he is going to ask is, if there is a meaningful conception of morality that's worth believing in, what are the necessary prerequisites? In other words, what are the criteria that would have to be met in order for us to say that morality had been served? Now, in his examination of morality, he will argue that at least these two things, although we're going to talk about more, at least these two things have to be possible. Hint, this might show up again. He is going to argue that if morality is to mean anything meaningful, then at least sometimes we must be able to exercise freedom of the will. Now, the word that you will see sometimes applied to this concept of free will starts with an A. Does anyone know the word? That word, I want you to know, is autonomy. To act with free will is sometimes said to act with autonomy. It's really not such a fancy Dan idea. It really means something like this. If I am autonomous, it means that there is a such thing as a self that is not merely a biological robot. If I am autonomous, it means there must be something that is me, that is not merely a biological robot, and that I meaningfully have the capacity to make choices. That is, that my choices are not merely conditioned puppet strings being pulled. Now, admittedly, the person who just acts out his unconscious desires, like I was talking about before, might be an individual who does not have full autonomy. Or at least he's not exercising his autonomy. Now notice if I say not exercising his autonomy, that seems to imply what?
He still has it.
Yeah, there might be some way to make it possible. At this point, I might be making a presupposition there that I may not be allowed to make. Now the other thing, and this is important, this was an idea I hope you got out of the homework question. He also argues that we must be able to overcome what appears to be we must at least sometimes be able to overcome what appears to some philosophers to be our innate egoism. Now, we've talked about egoism before. Yeah?
What's the difference between egoism and egotism?
I don't know that the person who is an egotist is, it's more or less a character. That's how we describe the character traits of a person who's basically always me first. Now, according to the doctrine of psychological egoism, Every single person is an egoist. It's just that our egoism sometimes takes different forms. In other words, if I get pleasure from being kind to people, the way that I carry out my self-interest is by being kind to people, because it makes me feel good. Now, if you happen to meet up with a sadist, let's hope that you don't unless you're a masochist. But yeah, if you meet up with a sadist who actually he feels best when he's harming other people, hurting people's feelings and so forth. You probably know people like this. Now that person satisfies his urges when he's harming people. So in his interpretation, that is what gives him pleasure. That's what makes him happy. Now notice that if egoism is in fact true, that the ultimate puppet string on every one of us is what? Yeah, is our egoism. And wherever that egoism might take us. Now, Immanuel Kant will contend that if there's no way to overcome egoism, then there is no significant reason to believe that we have free will. Because ultimately, we are just puppets of our egoistic drives. He took the problem of egoism seriously. He also took David Hume very seriously. Now you might remember at the end of our Hume lecture, David Hume articulated that whatever we do is ultimately always motivated by what? Is ultimately motivated by our sentiments. And if you don't like that word, sentiments, emotions. Now the text doesn't say this, but I want to put this on the record. David Hume was not a hard determinist. As a matter of fact, David Hume took a middle position called soft determinism. He understood that we are the products of various causal forces that influence the people that we are. But he believed that there was, if you will, a process of deliberation that he believed, right or not, we still hold people responsible for. Thus, we can still hold people responsible even if we really are ultimately motivated by the sentiments.
45.
Yeah. David Hume actually thought it was a good thing if we were motivated by our sentiments. Does anyone know why? Because if you learn how to inculcate the right sentiments into people, that you could actually make a decent society. In other words, if we train a person to feel empathy for his fellows, he is likely to do what? He is likely to want to do good by the people who are closest to him. And it would end up having a net positive results. It did not bother David Hume that morality was not purely a function of reason. Because he believed that if indeed reason was what motivated us, that we wouldn't be motivated to do anything at all. Because reason is passionless and abstract. And what David Hume believed, right or wrong, is that we are innately passionate beings. And that it is our passions that always drive us. Now, Immanuel Kant saw a serious problem with this. He believed that if we are indeed merely passionate beings, or as Hume put it, slaves to the passions, that there was no reason to actually hold anyone morally accountable in the strict sense. Why? Because you don't choose your emotions. Your emotions are genetically hardwired into you, even though he didn't have the language of genetics, he would have agreed with that. Or they are inculcated into you. And thus, if you were really just acting on your emotions, you are not significantly morally responsible anyway. And by the way, if you're only doing something because it makes you feel good, you're basically only doing it for what reason anyway? It ultimately reduces to selfishness anyway. And if something is done selfishly, then it ain't moral.